Thank you. Well, hello, everybody. I'm so pleased to be here. And always enjoy talking about Frances Perkins, my favorite dead person. Let me start by asking a very basic question, and it's really instructive for me as I go ahead with what I'm going to say. How many of you know who Frances Perkins is? Okay. Well, actually, it's a very good audience. You can tell it's a literary audience, and an audience of readers, that we have so many people who know who Frances Perkins is. And that really makes it fairly unusual. And I have to say, when I first began my research into Frances Perkins' life, I didn't know who she was myself. So one of the things that's so remarkable about her is that a woman who had such incredible accomplishments got so completely forgotten by history. And that was one of the things that sort of set me off on the detective search that I began, which was sort of to try to figure out how this person did so much and how she became so forgotten by history. First, let me start by a relatively short reading. It's going to be about 2 pages that will give you a sense of who Frances Perkins is. For those of you who already know, it will all be some old material. But for those of you who don't, I think you'll be shocked and amazed at how much a single person did. Let me start. On a chilly February night in 1933, a middle-aged woman waited expectantly to meet with her employer at his residence on East 65th Street in New York City. She clutched a scrap of paper with hastily written notes. Finally ushered into his study, the woman brushed aside her nervousness and spoke confidently. They bantered casually for a while, as was their style. Then she turned serious, her dark, luminous eyes holding his gaze. He wanted her to take an assignment, but she had decided she wouldn't accept it unless he allowed her to do it her own way. She held up the piece of paper in her hand, and he motioned for her to continue. She ticked off the items: a 40-hour work week, a minimum wage, workers' compensation, unemployment compensation, a federal law banning child labor, direct federal aid for unemployment relief, Social Security, a revitalized public employment service, and national health insurance. She watched his eyes to make sure he was paying attention and understood the implications of each demand. She braced for his response, knowing that he often chose political expediency over idealism and was capable of callousness, even cruelty. The scope of her list was breathtaking. She was proposing a fundamental and radical restructuring of American society with enactment of historic social welfare and labor laws. To succeed, she would have to overcome opposition from the courts, business, labor unions, conservatives. Nothing like this has ever been done before in the United States, she told him. You know that, don't you? The man sat across from her in his wheelchair, amid the clutter of boxes and rumpled rugs. Soon he would head to Washington, D.C. to be sworn in as the 32nd President of the United States. He would inherit the worst economic crisis in the nation's history. An era of rampant speculation had come to an end. The stock market had collapsed, rendering investments valueless. Banks were shutting down, stripping people of their lifetime savings. About a third of workers were unemployed. Wages were falling. Hundreds of thousands were homeless. Real estate prices had plummeted, and millions of homeowners faced foreclosure. His choice of labor secretary would be one of his most important early decisions. His nominee must understand economic and employment issues, but be equally effective as a coalition builder. He was a handsome man with aquiline features, and he studied the plain, matronly woman sitting before him. No one was more qualified for the job. She knew as much about labor law and administration as anyone in the country. He'd known her for more than 20 years, the last 4 in Albany, where she had worked at his side. He trusted her and knew she would never betray him. But placing a woman in the labor secretary's job would expose him to criticism and ridicule. Her list of proposals would stir heated opposition even among his loyal supporters. The 8-hour workday was a standard plank of the Socialist Party. Unemployment insurance seemed laughably improbable. Direct aid to the unemployed would threaten his campaign pledge of a balanced budget. Still, he said he would back her. It was a job she had prepared for all her life. She had changed her name, her appearance, even her age, to make herself a more effective labor advocate. She had studied how men think so she could better succeed in a man's world. She had spent decades building crucial alliances. Still, she told the president-elect that she needed time to make her decision. The next day, she visited her husband, a patient in a sanitarium. He was having a good day, and he understood when she told him about the job offer. His first impulse was to fret for himself, asking her how this new job might affect him. When she assured him that he could remain where he was and that her weekend visits would continue, he gave his permission. That night in bed, the woman cried in deep, wailing sobs that frightened her teenage daughter. She knew the job would change her life forever. She would open herself to constant media scrutiny, harsh judgment from her peers, and public criticism for doing a job a woman had never done before. Yet she knew she must accept the offer. As her grandmother had told her, whenever a door opened to you, you had no choice but to walk through it. The next day, she called Franklin Roosevelt and accepted the offer. Frances Perkins would become the nation's first female Secretary of Labor. Well, we know what happened. The Social Security Act, passed in 1935, gave us unemployment insurance, Social Security, and our welfare system, aid to dependent children, which was designed to help the children of mothers left to raise their children alone. And at this point, it was mostly women who were widowed and women whose husband had abandoned them. In fact, during the Great Depression, joblessness was so serious that a lot of men went off looking for work and just never came home. They just couldn't face the sad and hungry faces waiting at home. The Fair Labor Standards Act, passed in 1938, set a 40-hour work week to prevent workers from becoming broken from exhaustion. It set a minimum wage that ensured that they would receive at least a minimum level of compensation. It created a ban on child labor, and it allowed for the creation of overtime for workers asked to work long hours. And this is part of the genius of the New Deal, is the way that it works with the capitalistic system. In other countries, when people have set out to put limitations on work hours, they've imposed a flat limitation on how many hours people could work. But in the United States, FDR and Frances Perkins realized that business needs flexibility. When there's a chance for businesses to do more work, they need to have a chance to be able to get that extra work done and to create an incentive for people to be willing to do it. That's one of the geniuses of the New Deal, and part of the ways that capitalism is built into the New Deal is that workers who want to work longer hours are given the chance to do so, but they get extra pay for doing it. Other things Frances Perkins did: she was a major supporter of the FHA insurance program that helped workers buy houses. Now we know millions of Americans have bought homes in the last 5 decades because of the creation of the FHA insurance program. She was the primary architect of the Civilian Conservation Corps, which put hundreds of thousands of young men and women to work on national parks.